Hi, and welcome to My ADHD Superpower Is, a podcast about reframing ADHD by focusing on what we excel at, both in our professional and personal lives. My name is Sian, and I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 42. I always believed that you had to be an 8-year-old fidgety boy to get diagnosed with ADHD. It wasn't until I read an article about ADHD in women that I realised I had many of the same struggles and characteristics growing up. For years, I labelled myself as lazy or useless at certain things that others found really easy, like paying bills or attending and remembering appointments. And the ADHD diagnosis meant that I finally had an explanation for those struggles. ADHD isn't always a superpower, but by choosing to focus on our unique strengths and by being more accepting and forgiving of our weaknesses, I believe that we can live happier, more fulfilled lives. You're in the right place if you want to know how you can survive and thrive with ADHD in the corporate environment and how you can juggle many hobbies and be a parent and generally succeed at adulting in a neurotypical world. Hi everyone, so on today's episode we're going to talk about ADHD and creativity. I've always been quite creative ever since I was a very young child. I remember, I think it must have been in primary school, they asked us to build this indestructible structure. So I thought, oh well, egg box is quite a good shape. You know, let's base the structure on that. So with a few modifications, it was essentially just an egg box and other bits added to it. And all of the other kids had kind of built these giant structures with thin bits and like toilet roll tubes joined together, all kinds of things. And I remember winning this competition, and I probably was about 4 or 5. And they put the designs to test by kind of floating them in water, trying to compress them and things like that. And my little egg box adaptation won. So yeah, I think that's the first clue really that I had quite a creative kind of engineering brain. The other things that I absolutely loved to do when I was little, I was always drawing, especially people and horses. I absolutely loved to draw horses, and I was drawing them quite anatomically accurate as well. And yeah, I was just always fascinated by kind of writing stories and writing and kind of lots of creative pursuits. So I can totally identify with being quite a creative person, but I just wanted to look into it a bit more. Like, is this something that is ADHD or not? You know, is it just me, or is it an ADHD thing? And it seems that it might be an ADHD thing. So I started looking into what is it about ADHD that makes us kind of creative? What are the unique ways of thinking and doing things that kind of lead to this creativity? And I think there's a few things. So first of all, people with ADHD are often inattentive, so especially if you have the inattentive type or the combined type. And there's periods when you're inattentive and kind of daydreaming. That's maybe where the magic happens. And I think we can all kind of relate to this, that time when you've been thinking really hard on a problem and it's not coming to you, and then just the point when you're kind of going to relax and going to sleep, the idea will come to you in a revelation, and you have to, and if you've got a notebook by your bed, then you have to write it down before you forget. I think we can all relate to that. And that's kind of like what it's like having an ADHD brain. Sometimes when I have a project where I really need to get a plan down on paper or some slides, sometimes I might kind of sit there and think about it and ponder about the project for 3 hours. And the actual doing, once I've had that kind of creative thinking time, might only take me 30 minutes to get it down on paper. But it's kind of essential, that period where you're kind of thinking and reflecting. And I think every creative person can relate to that. You need space to kind of think about things and mull them over before you actually develop that creative project. The other thing as well, there's been a couple of studies that I was reading about that were quite interesting, because they did a couple of meta-analysis and systematic reviews, and really the studies weren't sort of showing that people with ADHD were particularly creative, but often the studies that they were looking at weren't really designed to answer that question. There are a couple of scientists who did some studies where they were actually kind of looking at the real world kind of application of creativity. So there are a couple of studies, actually. There's one where they were looking at university students and they asked them to design alien fruit. And obviously everyone has in their mind, fruits from Earth, like apples and bananas and things. So as it turned out, the people with ADHD versus the people without ADHD, they were able to create alien fruit that statistically significantly differed from the Earth fruit characteristics. So it seems that people with ADHD are actually able to kind of not let the constraints of existing ideas, existing frameworks influence them, and they're almost able to kind of brainstorm and come up with ideas that are divergent from things that currently exist. They also did a similar study as well in children, and that one was to design toys. And what they did was they actually gave them a toy that, as an example, and the children that had ADHD came up with toys that were significantly different from the model toys, whereas the children without ADHD, they took some inspiration and ideas from the model toy. So there's a couple of studies that are kind of indicating a similar thing that really reflects, I think at least, how I feel about myself and how I've kind of observed people that I know with ADHD, and that's that we're able to think outside of the box a little bit of problems and think beyond the kind of constraints of how we currently think and do things. So if you go to my blog, www.myadhdsuperpoweris.com, then I've linked to some of these interesting studies so you can take a look for yourself. But I just thought to myself, like, who that we know, from the science world or the kind of creative world has ADHD. And I don't know if any of you have been to the Einstein Museum in Bern, but if you haven't, it's really interesting. It's actually, the museum is actually in his very small kind of townhouse in Bern. And I remember reading a little bit about his school life and, how he was a bit disruptive as a child and he kind of flitted between one thing and another and he wasn't particularly studious. And I remember thinking, as I was reading this, wow, he sounds like he's got ADHD. Wow, that's fascinating because, it was just interesting to read. It was so clearly ADHD. And then when I got home, I kind of had a look to see if there was anything reported, that people suspected he had ADHD. And yeah, there are some experts who for sure think, yes, he either had ADHD or dyslexia because he clearly had some issues kind of expressing his ideas. And also I had a look and there were a couple of famous artists as well that experts believe kind of portrayed some of the classical symptoms of ADHD, and those are Leonardo da Vinci and Pablo Picasso as well. So yeah, it's always super interesting to see that we're not alone in our creative weirdness and that there are lots of incredible people from history as well who clearly had ADHD and those were their superpower as well. So that's it for today. I will go a little bit more into another topic which is kind of linked to this, multi-potentiality, next week, so stay tuned for that. And that's the end of this week's episode. Stay tuned and hit follow if you like what you hear, and look out for new episodes coming every Sunday. Thanks for listening.